What happens when the monster who saves you is more dangerous than the one you're running from? When an artist trapped by a human predator finds sanctuary in the arms of an immortal one. This is a story about cages, the ones we're forced into and the ones we choose. A tale of darkness that doesn't destroy light, but learns to protect it. Chapter 1. The lie was that her studio was a sanctuary. It was a cage, just one of her own making, smelling of turpentine and linseed oil instead of iron. Every canvas was a bar, every brushstroke a tally mark counting the days since she had last felt truly safe. Elena Vance moved through the cavernous space, the chill of the polished concrete floor seeping through thin slippers. Outside, the city exhaled a damp November breath against enormous warehouse windows, glass weeping with condensation. 6 days now. 6 days since the last phone call, the one where the only sound had been soft, rhythmic static of an open line, a sound she knew as intimately as her own heartbeat. It was his breath. Marcus, a name that was a shard of glass under her tongue. She stood before her easel, her latest work a maelstrom of charcoal and violent slashes of crimson acrylic. Meant to be a study of drapery, it had become a portrait of her fear, a writhing, formless thing trapped in a vortex of its own making. Her art had always been her voice, the only language that didn't catch in her throat. But lately the voice had grown hoarse, screaming the same word over and over. Tonight was the opening, her first solo show, a validation she had yearned for, a culmination of years spent in lonely, paint-spattered communion with her own soul. Now the thought of it was a knot of ice in her stomach. To be seen, to be exposed, was to make herself a target. Every stranger's gaze would feel like his. Every shadow in the corner would hold his shape. He had not come to the studio. He was smarter than that. His campaign was one of whispers and ghosts. A single perfect white rose, his signature, a mockery of purity, left on the hood of her car. Cheap cologne lingering in her apartment elevator. Hang-up calls after midnight. He was dismantling her world from the outside in, making every safe space feel violated, until only he remained. He wanted to be her only refuge, a fortress whose walls were built of his obsession. Chapter 2. Across the city, in a place where time was measured in centuries rather than hours, Lucian Thorne stood before a wall of black marble, the reflection staring back a familiar stranger. He was a king in a kingdom of shadows, his power absolute, his loneliness just as vast. For 500 years, he had watched the world of mortals spin on its frantic axis, a vibrant, chaotic tapestry of life and death that he could observe but never truly touch. He was a masterpiece of stillness in a world of motion, a creature of profound control whose deepest instincts were a tempest held in check by sheer force of will. On his desk lay an invitation, its elegant script announcing the opening of a new exhibition. He received dozens of these. His status as a collector and benefactor to the city's museums opened many doors. The nameplate outside the Metropolitan's Renaissance wing read, "The Lucian Thorne Collection." But this invitation was different. It featured a small reproduction of a painting titled "The Unseen Cage." Even in the poor quality of the print, something in the chaotic lines and desperate crimson slashes had reached across the page and seized him. It looked like his own soul made visible. He had no reason to walk through the brightly lit streets of the gallery district, a place so aggressively, artificially alive. But the painting called to him with a voice he couldn't ignore. That evening, he moved through the mortal world like a phantom, his presence an old, cold secret wrapped in tailored cashmere. The press of the crowd, bright, meaningless chatter, the scent of wine and perfume, it was all a thin veneer over the frantic, pulsing life he could feel thrumming just beneath their skin. It usually bored him, but then he saw it. The painting commanded the far wall, not with size, but with sheer, unbridled force. To the others, it was abstract expressionism, powerful but oblique. To Lucian, it was a confession. He saw the terror, yes, the raw, screaming panic of a trapped thing. But beneath it, he saw the artist's soul. A core of impossible resilience, a desperate, furious yearning for light. The lines were not random, they were a language of survival. The chaos was not madness, it was the anatomy of a spirit refusing to break. He felt a shock of recognition so profound, it was like a physical blow. In the frantic, desperate heart of that painting, he saw the echo of his own eternal prison, the gilded cage of immortality, the crushing weight of endless, unchanging years. For the first time in a century, he felt something other than the quiet, managed emptiness that had become his constant companion. He felt a connection, an electric, undeniable pull toward the mind that had bled this truth onto canvas. His eyes scanned the room, dismissing the preening faces, the false smiles, searching. And then he found her. She stood near the entrance, half hidden by a pillar, as if trying to merge with the architecture. She was small, fine-boned, with a cascade of dark hair that seemed to absorb the light. She clutched a wineglass with white-knuckled fingers, her gaze darting, flitting, never settling. She was a study in contained anxiety, a frightened bird with a warrior's heart. He could see it in the fierce set of her jaw, the straight line of her spine. She was terrified, but she was here. She was not hiding. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his ancient bones, that he was looking at the artist. And he knew, with a dawning sense of dread and wonder, that his long, quiet eternity had just been shattered. The world, which had been gray and silent for so long, was suddenly, terrifyingly, in color. As he watched, a man approached her. His smile was too wide, his posture too proprietary. Lucian felt another, much older instinct rise within him. A cold, dark, possessive fury. The instinct to protect. He did not move, but in the shadows of his mind, a predator uncoiled. The night had found its purpose. Chapter 3. The weeks following the gallery opening were a slow descent into a more refined hell. The show was a critical and commercial triumph that should have been the happiest time of Elena's life. Instead, every positive review felt like a spotlight, every sale a public declaration of her whereabouts. Marcus had been at the opening. She hadn't seen him, but she'd felt him. A cold spot in the warmth of the crowded room. A prickling on her skin that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. The next morning, a newspaper clipping of her smiling face was tucked under her apartment door, the eyes circled in red ink. Her life shrank. She stopped answering her phone unless she recognized the number. She had the locks on her studio and apartment changed, a futile gesture that only made the walls feel thinner. The police were sympathetic but helpless. There were no direct threats, no physical evidence. "He hasn't broken any laws, Ms. Vance," the tired-looking detective had said, his voice laced with practiced pity. "We can note the restraining order violation for the gallery, but without proof he was there, or direct threats, staring is not a crime. Being persistent is not a crime." But she knew it was. It was the crime of psychological erosion, the slow, deliberate dismantling of a person's peace. She tried to paint, to pour the acid of her fear onto canvas, but her hands would not obey. The studio, once her refuge, now felt vast and empty, its high ceilings amplifying every creak and groan of the old building. The enormous warehouse windows, she'd been a fool to work so exposed. She installed blackout curtains, heavy and oppressive, but they made her feel like she was working in a tomb. The shadows in the corners were no longer just absences of light, they were waiting, breathing things. She would work for hours, only to produce a canvas of muddy, hesitant grays, the color of her suffocating dread. Chapter 4. From his vantage point on the rooftop of an old hotel across the street, Lucian watched the light in her studio window burn late into the night. He had been drawn back to her world 3 nights after the gallery opening, unable to shake the connection he felt to her art. He told himself he was merely curious, that he wished to understand the soul behind the painting. But the truth was darker, more primal. He was captivated. He learned her rhythms, the lonely choreography of her existence. He saw her pace like a caged animal in her own creative space. He saw her jump at the sound of a passing siren, her hand flying to her chest. He saw her sit for hours before a blank canvas, shoulders slumped in defeat. Each night he took up his silent vigil. The city spread out below him, a glittering, indifferent beast. But his entire world had contracted to the single rectangle of light that was her window. He was a guardian gargoyle, a creature of stone and shadow, his purpose singular and absolute. He watched her walk home from the local market, his senses stretched taut, cataloging every person she passed, every car that slowed. That's when he saw the man who followed her. The first time, Lucian dismissed it, a coincidence. But the second night, and the third, the man was there again. Marcus. Lucian knew his name now, had learned everything about him with the terrifying efficiency of a being for whom information was just another resource to be consumed. He knew of his possessiveness, his history of manipulative behavior, the restraining order that was nothing more than a piece of paper. Seeing him in the flesh, watching him lurk in the periphery of Elena's vision, ignited a cold, patient rage in Lucian's chest. It was an ancient, predatory anger, the fury of a king whose territory had been invaded. He wrestled with the urge to simply remove the threat. It would be effortless. A flicker of movement in a dark alley, a whisper of violence, and the problem would cease to exist. But he could not. To do so would be to reveal himself, to trade her known fear for a new, monstrous one. And more than that, it would be a violation of her. He was drawn to her strength, her resilience. To intervene so brutally would be to deny the very spirit that had captivated him, to decide for her, to strip her of the dignity of facing her own battles. So he watched, and he waited, his control a thread stretched to its breaking point. He would not act unless he had no other choice. He would let her be the warrior she was, and he would be her unseen shield, the darkness that kept the other, lesser darkness at bay. Chapter 5. One evening, as cold rain began to fall, slicking the streets with a black sheen, he watched her leave the studio later than usual. She seemed exhausted, a fragile silhouette against the sodium-orange glow of streetlights. Marcus was there, half hidden in the recessed doorway of a closed shop. He didn't follow immediately. He waited, letting her get half a block ahead, savoring the hunt. Lucian felt the thread of his control begin to fray. He moved from the rooftop, a silent drop into the alley below, melting into deeper shadows. He flowed through the night, a ghost in the rain, his movements too fluid, too fast for the human eye to properly track. He kept pace with them, a silent parallel predator. He hoped he would not be needed. He prayed he was wrong about the man's intentions for tonight, but the predator in him knew better. The hunt was ending. The trap was about to be sprung. The rain fell harder, a percussive drumming on pavement that masked the sound of footsteps. Elena pulled the collar of her coat tighter, head down, hurrying toward the sanctuary of her apartment building just 2 blocks away. The street was mostly deserted, the weather having driven everyone indoors. A sense of profound isolation washed over her, as if the entire city had conspired to leave her alone with her fear. She fumbled in her bag for keys, fingers cold and clumsy. That's when she felt it again, the prickling certainty of being watched, so close now it was like a cold breath on her neck. She risked a glance over her shoulder, and her heart stopped. It was him, Marcus. Not lurking in a doorway this time, but walking, his pace deliberate, closing the distance between them. There was no pretense of coincidence now. His face, illuminated by the erratic flicker of a dying streetlight, was a mask of possessive hunger. His smile was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. Panic seized her, her breath hitched, her legs turning to lead. The apartment was too far, the studio too far behind. She was trapped in the open, on a glistening, empty street. She forced herself to walk faster, keys clutched in her fist, the metal teeth biting into her palm. She could hear his steps behind her, unhurried, confident. He was enjoying this. "Elena," he called out, his voice sickeningly soft poison in the night air. "Don't run from me. We need to talk." She didn't answer. She broke into a run, boots slipping on wet pavement. The sound of her own ragged breathing filled her ears. His footsteps quickened behind her, heavy and menacing. He was faster, stronger. He caught her arm just as she reached the alleyway that was a shortcut to her building's side entrance. His grip was like iron. He spun her around, slamming her back against the cold, wet brick of the alley wall. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. Rain plastered her hair to her face, mingling with sudden, hot tears of terror. "Let go of me, Marcus!" she gasped, her voice a pathetic whisper. "I can't do that," he said, his face inches from hers. The smell of rain and his cheap, cloying cologne filled her senses, a nauseating combination. "You belong to me. You think a little gallery show changes that? You think you can just erase me?" His eyes were wide, feverish. The obsession had consumed him entirely. He was no longer the man she had once, foolishly, loved. He was a monster wearing his skin. She struggled, pushing against his chest, but it was like trying to move a wall. His grip tightened, bruising her arm. "You're hurting me," she choked out. "Good," he snarled. "I want you to hurt. I want you to know how much I've been hurting." He raised his other hand, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to strike her. Instead, he reached out to touch her face, a gesture of grotesque tenderness. That was the moment the world broke. Chapter 6. From the deeper shadows of the alley, a shape detached itself. It wasn't a man running, it was a blur, a whisper of motion that defied physics. One moment, Marcus was looming over her, a figure of absolute menace. The next, he was gone, ripped away from her with impossible force. There was a sickening crack as he hit the opposite wall of the alley, 10 feet away, and then crumpled to the ground in a heap of sodden wool and broken limbs. Elena stared, her mind unable to process what her eyes had just seen. Standing where Marcus had been was another man, tall, dressed in dark, impeccably tailored clothes that seemed to drink the meager light. His stillness was absolute, a pocket of perfect calm in the storm of her terror. It was the man from the gallery, the one who had stood for so long before her painting. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes found hers. They were dark, ancient, and for a fleeting instant they held a terrifying, inhuman light, like embers burning in a deep well. Then it was gone, replaced by a look of profound concern. He took a step toward her, and she flinched, pressing herself back against the brick. "Are you harmed?" His voice was a low, resonant rumble, a strange comfort in the chaos. It was calm, controlled, utterly at odds with the impossible violence she had just witnessed. She couldn't speak. She could only shake her head, her gaze fixed on the still form of Marcus on the ground. Blood pooled beneath his head, mixing with the rain. The stranger's eyes followed hers. He looked at the broken man with a chilling lack of emotion, as if he were nothing more than trash to be discarded. Then his focus returned to her, softening. "He will not trouble you again." The statement was a vow, an unbreakable promise delivered with the weight of eternity. He moved closer, his movements preternaturally smooth. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently pull the hood of her coat up over her head, shielding her from the rain. His fingers brushed her temple, and his skin was impossibly cold, like marble. The touch sent a jolt through her, not of fear, but of something else. Something that felt like safety. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone must have heard the commotion. The stranger's expression became urgent. "I must go," he said. He pulled out her phone from where it had fallen, his movements a blur. His thumb moved across the screen with impossible speed. Then he pressed it into her trembling hand. "If you need anything, if you wish to speak, I've added my contact." and then he was gone. Not run, not walked. He simply stepped back into the deepest shadows of the alley and vanished. One moment he was there, a solid, grounding presence. The next, there was only the rain and the wail of approaching sirens. Elena stared at the empty space, her mind reeling. She looked down at her phone. A new contact, a single letter. L. She looked at Marcus's unmoving form, then back at the empty shadows. She had been saved, but she had the terrifying, exhilarating feeling that she had just been rescued from a monster by something far, far more dangerous. Chapter 7. The aftermath was a blur of flashing blue and red lights, of clipped, impersonal questions from uniformed officers, of the sterile, antiseptic smell of the hospital waiting room. Marcus was alive, but broken. Severe concussion, broken arm, dislocated shoulder, multiple contusions. The doctor said his injuries were consistent with being struck by a vehicle. The police report would read as a hit and run, the driver having fled the scene, after hearing Elena's screams scared them off. Elena gave them her statement. Marcus had grabbed her, slammed her against the wall. Her bruised arm was evidence enough. Then someone, something, had intervened. A figure in dark clothing. She'd been in shock, the rain, the darkness. She couldn't identify him. It wasn't entirely a lie. She couldn't explain what she'd seen. How could she tell them that her savior had moved faster than a striking snake, that he had thrown a 200-pound man across an alley as if he were a child's doll? Combined with the restraining order violation and the assault charges, Marcus was denied bail. He would be held until trial. She spent the next 2 days in self-imposed prison in her apartment, her phone sitting on the kitchen counter, the contact labeled L, a silent, potent accusation. Her body ached with bruises, but the deepest wounds were invisible. The trauma of the attack was raw and open, but it was tangled with the profound, terrifying mystery of her rescue. She replayed the moment in the alley over and over, the impossible speed, the chilling finality in his voice, the shocking, unnatural cold of his skin. Fear was a familiar companion, but this was a new species of it. It wasn't the cloying, suffocating fear Marcus had inspired. This was awe. Awe and a deep, unsettling curiosity that was stronger than her terror. He had saved her life. He had appeared from nowhere, a dark, avenging angel, and then vanished just as quickly. He had left her his contact, an invitation. On the third night, she could bear the silence no longer. Her apartment felt like it was shrinking around her, the walls crawling with unanswered questions. With a trembling hand, she opened her phone and pressed the contact. It rang only once before he answered. Elena? He said her name not as a question, but as a statement of fact, as if he had been waiting for her call. His voice was the same as she remembered, a deep, soothing timbre that seemed to vibrate through the phone and into her bones. How did you know it was me? She asked, her own voice thin and reedy. A pause. I knew. The simple, impossible answer hung between them. She didn't know what to say, what to ask. What are you? How did you do that? The questions were too large, too monstrous to voice. So she settled for something smaller, more human. I wanted to thank you. There is no need for thanks, he said. I am only sorry that my intervention was necessary at all. Another silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of everything unsaid. I'd like to thank you in person, she heard herself say, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. If that's all right. I would like that very much, he replied, and she could almost hear the ghost of a smile in his voice. There is a small park, the Jardin Noir, off the old quarter. It is quiet at this hour. Meet me by the fountain in 1 hour. He disconnected before she could reply. The Jardin Noir, the Black Garden, a place of shadows and secrets. It was perfect. She was terrified, and yet, for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. She felt a pull, an inexplicable need to step into the mystery that had saved her. Chapter 8. The park was an island of quiet in the heart of the city. The moon was a sliver of bone behind a scrim of thin clouds, and the air was crisp and cold. The fountain at the center of the garden was silent, its basin filled with dark, still water that reflected the skeletal branches of surrounding trees. He was already there, standing beside it, a silhouette against the lesser dark of the sky. He was not looking at her as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her every step. "Lucian," she said, her voice barely disturbing the silence. She'd found his full name in the contact details he'd entered. Lucian Thorne. He turned to face her. In the dim light, his features were stark and beautiful, like a sculpture carved from marble and moonlight. His eyes were dark and unreadable, but they were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. "Elena, I am glad you came." "You saved my life," she said simply, the words feeling inadequate. "I protected what is precious," he replied, his gaze unwavering. The words were simple, but they landed on her with the weight of a physical touch, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. They began to walk, their footsteps the only sound on the gravel path. She found herself talking, the words spilling out, about Marcus, the stalking, the fear that had poisoned her life and her art. She had told this story to the police, to her friends, but it had always felt like she was speaking a foreign language they couldn't quite understand. But Lucian listened, with a profound, unnerving stillness. He didn't offer platitudes or easy comforts. He just listened, his silence a vessel that could hold the entirety of her pain. "He wanted to own me," she finished, her voice thick with emotion. "To own my art, my life. To make my world so small it only had room for him. Some creatures believe that to possess beauty, they must first cage it," Lucian said, his voice soft. "They do not understand that the beauty they admire is in the thing's wildness, its freedom." He looked at her then, and she felt as though he were seeing not just her, but the very essence of her, the caged, wild thing she had poured onto her canvases. "Your art is not a thing to be caged." They talked for hours, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time seemed to warp around him, to stretch and slow. He spoke of history as if he had witnessed it, of art with the passion of a true connoisseur. He mentioned the Renaissance wing of the Metropolitan, his collection there, his centuries of gathering beauty. She caught the slip, centuries, but he moved past it smoothly, turning the conversation back to her. He deflected every direct question about himself with elegant, effortless grace. Yet she felt more seen, more understood in his presence than she had with anyone in her life. As the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, a sense of urgency seemed to come over him. "It is late," he said, his tone shifting. "You should be home." He walked her to the edge of the park. Under the amber glow of a street lamp, she saw that his skin was pale, almost translucent, and there were faint, bruised-looking shadows under his eyes. He looked tired, in a way she couldn't quite define. "Will I see you again?" she asked, the question feeling bold, reckless. "Tonight," he said, without hesitation. "If you wish it." She nodded. "Tonight." He gave her a small, sad smile, and then turned and walked away, disappearing into the fading darkness of the pre-dawn city. Elena watched him go, a strange mix of gratitude, confusion, and a burgeoning, dangerous fascination churning within her. He was a puzzle, a paradox of impossible strength and profound gentleness. And she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that she was going to keep trying to solve him. Chapter 9. Their nights became a ritual, a secret world carved out of the hours between dusk and dawn. Lucian would appear as if summoned by the deepening twilight, a constant, reassuring presence. They walked through the sleeping city, their conversations weaving a tapestry of intimacy. He was a perfect gentleman, his manners archaic and deeply ingrained. He never touched her, except for the occasional, fleeting brush of his hand against her back to guide her across a street, a touch as cold and brief as a snowflake. He drew her out of her shell. He took her to private after-hours viewings at museums, His status as a benefactor opened doors. He would stand with her before a Rembrandt or a Caravaggio, speaking of light and shadow with an authority that felt centuries deep. He talked about the fall of Rome as if recalling a conversation from the previous week, and described the court of the Medici with the wry familiarity of an insider. He was the most brilliant, enigmatic man she had ever met. Slowly, cautiously, Elena began to live again. The fear of Marcus, now safely incarcerated and awaiting trial, began to recede, replaced by the consuming mystery of Lucian. She started painting again, her hands sure and steady for the first time in a year. Her studio, once a place of anxiety, was reclaimed, and Lucian was a part of its reclamation. He would come to her studio late at night, standing for hours in perfect silence as he watched her work. He never offered critique, never interrupted. He simply watched, his presence a steadying anchor in the creative storm. Under his intense, appreciative gaze, her work transformed. The frantic, terrified lines of her earlier pieces softened, deepened. She was no longer painting her fear, but her fascination. Her canvases filled with nocturnes, with cityscapes bathed in moonlight, with studies of shadow and form. Unconsciously, she began to paint him. Not his face, not directly, but his essence. A tall, dark figure of immense stillness and power, a guardian at the edge of the light. Her life was bifurcated into day and night. The daylight hours were a pale, washed-out waiting period. She would sleep late, run errands in a haze, her thoughts constantly drifting toward the coming evening. But when the sun began to set, her world came into sharp, vibrant focus. The night belonged to Lucian. And increasingly, she belonged to it too. Chapter 10. Yet the questions remained, unspoken but persistent. They were tiny cracks in the beautiful, strange reality they had built. She had never seen him eat or drink. When she offered him coffee, he would politely decline. When she suggested a late dinner, he would gently steer them toward a walk instead. He existed entirely in the dark. Their meetings always ended as the first hint of dawn threatened the sky, a sudden, almost pained urgency coming over him. One evening, she gathered her courage. "Lucian," she said as they walked along the river, "why have we never met during the day? I'd love to show you my studio in natural light, or grab lunch somewhere." He was quiet for a long moment. "I keep unusual hours," he said finally. "A lifetime of insomnia. The night suits me." "A lifetime?" she pressed gently. His lips curved in a small, enigmatic smile. "A very long lifetime." She wanted to push further, but something in his expression made her hold back. There was a warning there, a boundary she wasn't yet ready to cross. But the question sat, small and persistent, in the back of her mind. One night in her studio, she was working on a new piece. A large canvas depicting a lone, ancient tree under a sky full of stars. Lucian was standing near the windows, looking out at the city lights. She turned to ask him a question about the color of the night sky, and as she did, her elbow knocked a heavy ceramic jar full of brushes off a nearby table. She lunged for it, but she was too slow. It fell. Except it didn't. One moment, Lucian was by the window. The next, he was beside her, the jar cradled in his palm. She hadn't seen him move. There was no blur of motion, no running steps. He was simply there, as if he'd teleported. He looked from the jar to her, and his eyes were wide with something she had never seen in them before. Alarm. He slowly placed it back on the table, his movements deliberate, controlled. But the spell was broken. The impossible had just happened, right in front of her. "How did you do that?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. He looked at her, his face a mask of carefully composed neutrality, but she could see the conflict in his eyes. "Fortunate reflexes," he said, his voice smooth. But it wasn't reflexes. It was a violation of the laws of nature. She stared at him, at his profound stillness, his marble-cold skin, his ancient eyes that had seen too much. And all the little inconsistencies, all the unanswered questions, coalesced into one monstrous, unbelievable thought. The way he moved, the way he only lived in the night, his impossible strength, his deep, world-weary sadness. She felt the ground give way beneath her. She was falling for a man who was not a man at all. He was something else, something older, darker, and more powerful than she could possibly imagine. The awe she felt for him was suddenly shot through with a terrifying, primal fear. The guardian angel who had saved her might just be the most dangerous creature she had ever met. Her voice was trembling when she spoke again, the question tearing from her throat. "What are you, Lucian?" Chapter 11. The question hung in the air of the studio, stark and fragile. It was the only sound, save for the hum of the city far below and the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart. The scent of oil paint and turpentine, usually a comfort, now felt cloying, suffocating. Lucian stood perfectly still, the jar of brushes in his hand looking like a child's toy. The mask of calm he wore so effortlessly had finally cracked, revealing the deep, ancient sorrow beneath. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw 500 years of loneliness, of secrets, of a terrible, profound hunger for a life he could never have. He had known this moment would come. He had dreaded it, rehearsed it 1,000 times in the silent theater of his mind, and yet he was utterly unprepared for the reality of it. He was unprepared for the raw fear in her eyes that had, for a few precious months, looked at him with trust and fascination. To see that trust curdle into terror was a pain sharper than any physical wound. "I had hoped," he began, his voice a low, rough whisper, "that you would never have to ask that question." "But I am asking it," she insisted, taking a half-step back. The movement was small, instinctive, but it felt like a chasm opening between them. "The alley, the way you move, the fact that I have never, not once, seen you in the daylight. You are always cold. You never eat. What are you?" He set the jar down with painstaking care, as if the slightest tremor might shatter the fragile reality they had built. He turned his full attention to her, his gaze holding hers, refusing to let her look away. He owed her the truth. He owed her that much, even if it meant losing her forever. "Everything you have observed is true," he said, his voice even, devoid of drama or theatrics. He would not hide behind riddles or half-truths. She deserved more than that. "There is a reason I exist only in the night. There is a reason for my strength, for the coldness of my skin." He took a slow, deliberate breath, a habit he had retained from a life long past, a pantomime of humanity. "The stories your world tells are exaggerations. Distortions of a truth that is both simpler and more terrible." He paused, gathering the last of his courage. "I am a vampire, Elena." The word fell into the silence of the room like a stone into a deep well. Vampire. It sounded absurd, a word from Gothic novels and cheap horror movies. It didn't belong here, in her brightly lit studio, with her half-finished paintings and the familiar, comforting mess of her life. But as she looked at him, at his deathly pale skin, his inhuman stillness, the profound, ancient sadness in his eyes, the word settled into a place of terrifying truth. It made a horrible, perfect sense of everything. Her mind recoiled. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she gripped the back of a stool to steady herself. Her savior, her confidant, the enigmatic, gentle man she had been falling in love with, was a monster. A predator, a creature that fed on the life of others. The blood drained from her face. Did he look at her and see food? The thought was so vile it made her want to retch. Lucian saw the wave of revulsion and horror wash over her face. He saw her mind making the connections, leaping to the darkest conclusions. He could feel her pulling away from him, her spirit recoiling as if he had burned her. "I have never," he said, his voice laced with desperate urgency, "and I would never harm you, or any human. That is not the life I have chosen." But his words were lost in the roar of her fear. The intimacy they had shared, now felt like a grotesque violation. His gentle concern, his deep understanding, had it all been a predator's calculated patience, a way to lull his prey into a false sense of security? "Get out," she whispered, the words small and brittle. "Elena, please," he implored, taking a step toward her. "Get out!" she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, raw and ragged. She grabbed the nearest thing, a palette knife, and held it in front of her, a pathetic, useless weapon. Her hand was shaking so violently she could barely hold it. "Don't come near me. Just go!" The sight of her, so terrified, brandishing that tiny blade against him, a creature who could tear down the walls of the building with his bare hands, broke something deep inside him. He had brought the very terror he sought to banish back into her life. He had become the monster in her room. He stopped, his posture slumping in a way she had never seen before. The powerful, regal being was gone, replaced by someone who looked impossibly old and weary. He gave her a single, sharp nod of acquiescence. The pain in his eyes was so profound, so naked, that for a fleeting second it pierced through her terror. "As you wish," he said softly. He turned and walked to the door, his movements for once looking heavy, burdened. He did not look back. The door clicked shut behind him, and Elena was left alone in the sudden, deafening silence of her studio, the palette knife falling from her nerveless fingers and clattering to the floor. The cage she had just escaped had slammed shut again, but this time the monster was not outside the bars. It was the man she had invited inside. Chapter 12. The days that followed were a gray, featureless landscape of shock and confusion. Elena didn't leave the studio. She unplugged her phone, ignored the emails that piled up, and let the world outside fall away. She existed on coffee and the stale crackers she found in the back of a cupboard, moving through the cavernous space like a ghost. The silence Lucian left behind was a living thing, a heavy, suffocating presence that was louder than any noise. Her mind was a battlefield. One part of her, the logical, rational part, screamed that he was a monster, a creature of nightmare. Vampire. The word itself was a brand, a condemnation. It conjured images of teeth and blood, of soulless predators who mimicked humanity to hunt it. She thought of his strength in the alley, the casual, terrifying violence with which he had dispatched Marcus. It wasn't the act of a human protector. It was the act of a superior predator eliminating a rival. Every kindness he had shown her, every moment of connection, was now tainted, suspect. She felt like a fool, a naive child who had mistaken a wolf for a sheepdog simply because it had protected her patch of grass. But another part of her, a quieter, more stubborn voice, refused to be silenced. It replayed their conversations, not with suspicion, but with a dawning, painful clarity. It remembered the look in his eyes when he spoke of art, the genuine reverence. It recalled the profound loneliness that clung to him like a shroud, the way he listened to her with an attentiveness that went beyond mere patience. It remembered the flash of raw pain on his face just before he left her studio, a look of such utter devastation that it couldn't possibly have been a lie. He had never lied to her. He had evaded, he had omitted, but he had never once uttered a falsehood. And when she had confronted him, he had given her the truth, knowing it would likely destroy everything between them. Was that the act of a manipulative monster? She found herself at her easel, her hands moving of their own accord. She didn't mix paints. She picked up a stick of charcoal, the raw elemental black. She began to sketch. She drew his hands, long-fingered and elegant, remembering how they had gently settled the jar of brushes on the table, the care in the gesture. She drew his silhouette as he stood by the window, a figure of immense power held in perfect, sorrowful check. She tried to draw his eyes, but she couldn't capture them. They were too old, too deep. They held the weight of centuries she couldn't possibly comprehend. Her studio became a gallery of his memory. The sketches were not monstrous. They were portraits of a powerful, solitary being, a guardian, a king in exile. The central conflict in her mind slowly shifted. The question was no longer, what is he? She had the answer to that. The question became, who is he? She had been saved from a human monster by a non-human one. Marcus, with his human heart and his human desires, had sought to consume her spirit, to cage her and diminish her until she was merely a reflection of his own ego. Lucian, the creature of the night, the vampire, had done the opposite. He had guarded her freedom. He had watched over her, protecting her space to create. He had listened to her, seen her, and in his presence, her art had been reborn. One truth became undeniable. With Marcus, she had felt her world shrinking. With Lucian, she had felt it expand to encompass history, art, the vast, silent beauty of the night. He had not caged her, he had shown her a world without bars. A week after he had gone, she stood in the center of her studio, surrounded by the charcoal ghosts of him. She looked at her most recent painting on the easel, the one she had been working on when he left. The Nocturne, a dark, sprawling city under a canopy of brilliant, indifferent stars. And in the foreground, a single ancient tree, its roots deep in the earth, its branches reaching for the sky. It was a portrait of endurance, of loneliness, of a life that persisted through endless nights. It was him. The fear that had paralyzed her was finally receding, burned away by the brighter flame of understanding. He was what he was, an impossible, terrifying, beautiful truth. But his nature did not negate his character. His actions, his choices, his profound, gentle respect for her, those were his truth too. She had run from the label, from the word vampire. She had not stopped to look at the man. Her decision was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, quiet settling, like dust motes in a beam of moonlight. She had to see him. She had to tell him that she saw him, not the monster of her imagination. She grabbed her coat, her heart no longer pounding with fear, but with a fragile, determined hope. She walked out of her studio and into the night, not as prey, but as someone finally choosing to step out of the cage for good. Chapter 13. She went to the Jardin Noir. The air was colder now, with the sharp, clean bite of approaching winter. The moon was nearly full, bathing the Gothic park in a wash of pale, ethereal light. The cypress trees cast long, skeletal shadows on the frosted ground. She walked to the silent fountain where they had first truly met, and sat on the cold stone edge, pulling her coat tight around her. And then she waited. Hours passed. The city's hum softened to a distant whisper. A lone taxi hissed by on the wet street outside the park gates. She watched her breath plume in the frigid air, a fleeting ghost of her own life. Doubt began to creep in. What if he was gone? What if, in her fear and rejection, she had severed the connection completely? What if he had respected her wishes so thoroughly that he had removed himself from her life, a silent guardian no more? The loneliness she had felt in the studio was nothing compared to the vast, empty feeling that threatened to overwhelm her now. She had pushed away the one person who had made her feel safe, who had seen the truth of her, and she had done it because she was afraid of a word. Just as a sliver of despair began to take root, she felt a shift in the air, a subtle drop in temperature, a sudden stillness in the night. She looked up. He was there, standing at the edge of the shadows beneath the largest cypress tree, as if he had materialized from the darkness itself. He did not approach, but simply stood and watched her, his face unreadable in the gloom. She rose slowly, her legs stiff from the cold. Her heart was a wild, frantic bird in her chest. This was it. The chasm was between them again, wider than ever. It was up to her to cross it. She took a step, and then another, her boots crunching softly on the gravel path. She walked toward him, out of the moonlight and into the deep shadow where he stood. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the guarded, painful hope in his eyes. "I was afraid," she said, her voice small but clear in the profound silence. His expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of something in the depths of his gaze. I know. I was wrong to be, she continued, the words gaining strength. I reacted to a story I've been told my whole life. I didn't look at you, the person you've been to me. He remained silent, letting her speak, giving her the space she needed. You have never been a monster to me, Lucian, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. The only monster in my life was a human one. You were the one who saved me from him. You gave me back my safety. You gave me back my art. She took a final, trembling step forward, closing the distance between them. She looked up into his face, into his ancient, sorrowful eyes. I see you, and I am not afraid anymore. To prove it, to make the declaration absolute, she did the one thing she had never dared to do. She reached up and placed her palm gently against his cheek. His skin was just as she remembered, impossibly cold, like marble unearthed from the deep earth. He flinched at her touch, a barely perceptible tremor, his eyes closing for a brief second as if in pain. When he opened them again, the guarded control was gone, replaced by a raw, staggering vulnerability. Elena, he whispered her name, and it was a prayer, a lament, a lifetime of loneliness packed into a single word. It's all right, she said softly, her thumb stroking his cold skin. I'm here. He did not move, did not speak. He simply stood there, letting her touch him, a creature of immense power allowing himself to be anchored by the warmth of a mortal hand. In that single, silent gesture, the chasm between them closed. The truth of what he was no longer mattered as much as the truth of who he was. Their new beginning was not one of fiery passion, but of a quiet, profound acceptance. A connection forged in darkness and fear, and finally, sealed by a courageous touch in the cold moonlight. Chapter 14. Their relationship, reborn in the stark honesty of the Jardin Noir, deepened into something neither of them had ever known. The nights that followed were a gentle relearning of one another, a rediscovery of the trust that had been shattered. With the truth of his nature between them, an unspoken barrier had dissolved. An astonishing intimacy bloomed in its place. He began to let her into his world, not just the city at night, but the world of his own long, solitary existence. He took her to his home, a sprawling penthouse apartment in a historic Art Deco building that overlooked the entire city. It wasn't a Gothic lair, but a place of quiet, monastic elegance, filled with books that reached the high ceilings, art that spanned centuries, and a profound, pervasive silence. It was the home of a man who had curated his eternity with meticulous, lonely care. Here he shared stories of his life, of the man he had been, a scholar in Renaissance Florence, and the night his mortal life had ended. He spoke of his first century as a creature of instinct and rage, and the long, slow journey back to the man he had wanted to be, a journey of control, of atonement. One night, as they sat in his library, surrounded by the ghosts of centuries, she asked the question that had been weighing on her. How do you survive, Lucian, without harming anyone? His expression grew somber. I have arrangements, he said quietly. Blood banks, medical waste that would otherwise be discarded. I have not taken from a living human in over 2 centuries. He looked at her, and she saw the shame and the pride warring in his eyes. It is sustenance without pleasure, survival without joy. I will not lie, the hunger exists. But I choose how I answer it. Every night, for 200 years, I have made that choice. She reached for his hand, lacing her warm fingers through his cold ones. Thank you for telling me. In return, she brought life into his stillness. She filled the silence of his apartment with music. She brought him a small potted plant, a stubborn splash of green, and placed it on a windowsill where it could catch the morning sun long after he had retreated to the darkness. It was a foolish, sentimental gesture, but when he saw it, he touched one of its leaves with a look of such tender reverence that it made her heart ache. She was teaching him how to live again, while he was teaching her what it meant to be truly timeless. Chapter 15. He helped her confront the ghosts of her trauma. One night, he took her back to the alley where he had saved her. She tensed as they approached, the memory of the cold brick and Marcus's menacing face rising in her mind. But Lucian simply stood beside her, his presence a solid, unshakable wall of safety. He didn't speak, he just waited. She looked at the space, no longer a sight of terror, but of her salvation. She looked at him, the dark guardian who had emerged from its shadows. "It's just an alley," she said, the words a quiet revelation. The power it held over her was gone. Her art flourished in this new atmosphere of absolute safety and profound inspiration. Her studio became their sanctuary. He would read in an armchair in the corner while she painted, the quiet rustle of his turning pages a comforting counterpoint to the swish of her brushes on canvas. She began a new series of paintings, bolder and more complex than anything she had done before. They were portraits of him, not just his physical form, but of their shared world. She painted him as a shadow cast by moonlight, as the stillness at the heart of a storm, as a dark, elegant line against the vibrant chaos of the city. Her work was no longer about fear or even fascination. It was about love. A strange, paradoxical love between light and shadow, warmth and cold, mortality and eternity. Their physical intimacy was a slow, tentative exploration. The first time he truly held her, it was in her studio, after she'd finished a painting, exhausted and emotionally spent. She had simply leaned against him, and his arms had come around her, hesitant at first, then firm and sure. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the complete, unnerving lack of a heartbeat, the absolute stillness of his body. But there was a different kind of life in him, an ancient, powerful energy that seemed to hum beneath his cold skin. It was in that silent, still embrace that she felt the true depth of their connection. His coldness didn't matter. His stillness was a rock. He was her anchor. He, in turn, was mesmerized by her humanity. He would watch her sleep, a faint flush on her cheeks, her chest rising and falling with the simple, miraculous rhythm of her breath. He would touch a stray strand of her hair, marveling at its softness, at the vibrant, fleeting warmth of her skin. She was a universe of fleeting, beautiful moments, a laugh, a frown, a sigh. To him, who had seen empires rise and fall, these tiny, ephemeral expressions of her life were the most precious things in existence. She was a candle flame, brilliant and beautiful and terrifyingly brief, and he was the endless, surrounding darkness, finding his own purpose in guarding her light. His centuries of loneliness had not been a curse, he realized, but a long, long journey that had, impossibly, led him to her. Their love was not spoken in grand declarations, but in 1,000 quiet moments. It was in the way he would appear at her studio window the moment the sun had fully set, his eyes searching for her. It was in the way she would leave a book open for him on the table, a passage marked that she thought he would like. It was a love built on the effort to understand, a constant, tender negotiation between two vastly different worlds. He was healing from the wound of his own eternal isolation, and she was healing from the fear that the world was a place of hidden human monsters. Together, they were creating a new world, a sanctuary for two, where a vampire and an artist could find a common language in the space between heartbeats, in the shared appreciation of a line of poetry, in the quiet, unshakable knowledge that they were, finally and completely, seen. Chapter 16. The seasons turned. The sharp cold of winter softened into the damp, hopeful breath of spring. Marcus was a fading memory, a name in a court document, his power over her utterly broken. Elena's life, once a small, barricaded thing, had become vast and fearless. Her new collection of paintings, the nocturnes and portraits of shadow and light, was scheduled for a new show. This time, the thought of the opening filled her not with dread, but with a quiet, confident joy. She had a story to tell, a new language she had discovered, and she wanted the world to see it. Lucian's world, once a static, unchanging landscape of shadow, was now filled with color and warmth, all of it emanating from her. He had found a reason to anticipate the setting of the sun, a reason to engage with the turning of the world. He had spent centuries as an observer, a ghost at the feast of life. With Elena, he was a participant. Her laughter was the first music he had truly heard in 100 years. Her passion for her work, her fierce, fragile humanity, had reawakened the parts of him he thought had long since turned to dust. The question of their future, of her mortality and his immortality, was a constant, unspoken presence between them. It was not a source of tension, but of a deep, poignant tenderness. He would watch her sometimes, a fleeting shadow of pain crossing his features as he contemplated the simple, brutal arithmetic of her lifespan against his. He would never ask her to sacrifice her life, her warmth, her sunlit world, for his eternity of darkness. The choice, if there was one, had to be hers, and his love for her was so absolute that he would rather endure losing her than ever see her caged, even in a gilded cage of eternal life with him. She understood his silence. She knew the weight of the gift he could offer and the price it would demand. She saw the conflict in him, the battle between his desire to keep her forever and his profound respect for her freedom. And in his silent, selfless struggle, she saw the purest expression of his love. But she had already begun to make her choice, in small, imperceptible ways. Her gallery show had been scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, prime viewing hours with natural light flooding the space. She'd requested it be moved to an evening opening instead. "The work is meant to be seen in darkness," she'd told the curator. "It loses something in daylight." She found herself sleeping later and later, her most productive hours coming after sunset. She stopped making lunch plans with friends, preferring late dinners that stretched into the small hours of the morning. She had never been a morning person anyway, she told herself. But the truth was simpler and more profound. The day felt empty now, colorless, a waiting room for the real world that began when the sun went down. One evening she attended a colleague's art opening, a rare daytime event she couldn't avoid. Sunshine streamed through tall windows, illuminating abstract paintings in harsh, unforgiving light. Critics praised the work, collectors bought pieces. She smiled and made conversation, but felt like a ghost at her own life. She kept glancing at her watch, counting the hours until sunset, until he would emerge, until she could be whole again. That's when she knew. The choice had already been made. She hadn't lost the day. She'd found her true life in the darkness. Chapter 17. One evening they were in her studio. The space was filled with her new work, ready to be transported to the gallery. The paintings were a testament to their journey, a visual chronicle of their love. Lamplight cast a warm, golden glow on the canvases, on the familiar, beautiful chaos of her workspace. She was at her easel, putting the final touches on the last piece of the collection. It was a self-portrait of a kind. It depicted the two of them. She stood in a pool of warm, vibrant light, her brush in hand, her face turned toward a tall, dark figure beside her. He stood just at the edge of the light, half in shadow, his hand not quite touching hers, but the space between their fingers was charged with an electric, undeniable energy. It was a portrait of two separate worlds, two different natures, reaching for each other, creating a space of impossible, beautiful balance. Lucian stood behind her, watching her work. He made no sound, but she could feel his presence, a steady, comforting weight at her back. "It's finished," she said softly, laying down her brush. She turned on the stool to face him. He looked from the painting to her, his ancient eyes full of an emotion so deep it was almost overwhelming. "It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," he said, his voice thick. "It's the truest thing I've ever painted," she replied. She reached out and took his cold hands in her warm ones, lacing her fingers through his. "This is our world. This is us." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage for what came next. Lucian, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Can someone like me become what you are? His entire body went rigid. Elena, can they? She pressed. Yes, he said quietly. But the cost. Tell me, she said firmly. Tell me everything. I need to know what it means. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with a terrible, conflicted hope. You would need to feed, he said, his voice raw. Not kill. I can teach you control, discipline, but you would need blood. The hunger would be constant, especially in the beginning. Go on, she said. Sunlight would become your enemy. You would watch your friends age and die. Your family would mourn you. You would have to disappear, become someone new, over and over again through the centuries. He cupped her face with both hands, his touch achingly gentle. Your art. You could still create, but differently. Night would be your canvas. And the change itself, it is not painless. It is a death and a rebirth. What about my work now? She asked. The daylight in my paintings. Would I lose the ability to capture it? You would remember it, he said. Memory can be as powerful as sight. But yes, it would change. Everything would change. She nodded slowly, processing. I need time, she said. Not to decide. I think I already know what I want. But time to prepare. To say goodbye in my own way. To settle things. Take all the time you need, he said, though she could see the tremor in his hands, the desperate hope he was trying so hard to control. This is not a choice to be made lightly. If you decide against it, I will love you for every moment of your mortal life, and I will remember you for all of eternity after. She pulled him close, pressing her face against his cold chest. I've spent months painting only at night with you. My best work comes in darkness now. And I'd rather have centuries with you than decades watching you from a distance, knowing what we could have had. She pulled back to look at him. I choose this. I choose the night. I choose the centuries. I choose you, Lucian. Forever. His breath hitched, a ghost of a human reaction. He brought her hands to his lips, his cold mouth pressing against her warm skin. It was a gesture of fealty, of gratitude, of a love that had crossed the boundary of life and death itself. He looked at her, and for the first time, the sorrow in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by the brilliant, dazzling light of a future he had never dared to imagine. My love, he whispered. My eternity. Epilogue. 3 months later, Elena Vance's memorial service was held on a gray spring morning. The gallery had closed for the day, her paintings draped in black cloth. Friends and colleagues spoke of her talent, her passion, the bright flame of her life extinguished too soon. A tragic accident, they said. So sudden, so unfair. In the back row, a dark-haired woman in elegant black sat in silence, her face partially obscured by a veil. No one recognized her. No one knew that she had spent the last weeks of her human life methodically closing the door on that existence. She had created a will, leaving her work to be managed by a trust. She had written letters to her distant family, saying she needed to travel, to find herself, to heal from the trauma Marcus had inflicted. She had said her goodbyes to her old life with clear eyes and no regrets. As the service ended, the woman slipped out a side door and into a waiting car with tinted windows. Inside, Lucian was waiting. He took her hand, no longer warm, but cool like his own. She was pale now, her skin like porcelain, her eyes holding a new depth, a new darkness. But her smile was the same, her spirit undiminished. Ready? He asked. Ready, she said. They had centuries ahead of them. Time to paint 1,000 nocturnes, to walk through 1,000 cities, to witness the turning of ages together. She would learn to live in the darkness, and he would remember what it meant to live, period. Together, they would create their own masterpiece, not on canvas, but in the way they chose to spend their immortal nights. A vampire king and his artist queen, two impossible beings who had found each other across the boundaries of life and death. They drove through the city as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Elena watched through the tinted window, remembering the warmth of daylight on her skin. She felt no regret. She turned to Lucian, and he was watching her with an expression of such profound love and gratitude that it took her breath away, even though she no longer needed to breathe. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I was wrong," she said softly. "All those paintings about cages? I was looking at it backwards." "How so?" "The daylight wasn't freedom. It was just a different kind of cage, one made of fear and smallness and mortality. This," she gestured between them, at the gathering darkness outside, at the endless night ahead. "This is what freedom looks like." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her cool skin.